So I'm going to introduce our first keynote speaker, Charlotte Biltekoff. Charlotte and I have traveled in similar scholarly circles for many years, and we actually now have similar academic positions in land-grant universities at in the United States, so it's really fun to have Charlotte come here to UVM. She's an associate professor of American Studies and Food Science and Technology at UC Davis, where she builds bridges between scientific and cultural approaches to questions about food and health. She's the author of Eating Right in America, The Cultural Politics of Food and Health, and she looks at the social and cultural dimensions of dietary advice and the changing meaning of eating right over the last century. And her current project includes analysis of fault lines and fractures within the contemporary conversations about processed food, and maybe some ideas about the good in processed food and the future of food. It is my pleasure to invite Charlotte Biltekoff.
Thank you so much. There's nothing on. Okay. So it's really, I'm totally delighted to be here. This food systems program and the conference and the kinds of conversations that are being brought together here today are exactly the kinds of conversations and approaches that I care about most. I'm incredibly inspired and encouraged by especially the transdisciplinary commitment of the food systems program that Doug has described to us this morning. And I'm really excited to have an opportunity to talk and speak with you over the next couple of days around this question of what makes food good, which essentially is the question that lies at the heart of my research program. It's the question that I'm driven by, that I'm passionate about, that I really care deeply about. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to discuss it with you today. And I'm just waiting to make sure the slides come up. Oh, there it is. Okay, great. So if we're going to spend a couple of days thinking about what makes food good, I thought we might start by thinking about a very good food, the green juice. And if we want to understand what makes a green juice good, there are certainly a lot of different scientific frames that we could think through, right? We could understand its goodness through the lens of nutritional science. We could think about what makes it good through the lens of sensory science, right? Its hedonic or sensory properties, the pleasures that it provides. We could think about its goodness through environmental science or sustainability science, thinking about its impacts. We could think about it through toxicology. There's a lot of different scientific frames we could think through, and these scientific ways of knowing goodness do tend to dominate our conversations, particularly in the academy, about what makes food good. And in the popular or public domain, I increasingly notice that consumer concerns about whether or not their food is good are often characterized as problems sort of stemming from a lack of understanding of science or a lack of scientific literacy, and met with assertions of scientific facts and information. But really, I want to point to all the things that make the green juice good that science can't tell us, right? There's really so much about what makes it good that we have to understand through a different set of lenses. And it's what I want to do in my talk today is really explore those edges and those limits of scientific ways of understanding goodness, and to explore the social and cultural and contextual elements of what makes the green juice good and of what makes food good. And I want to ask that you keep a question in mind as I'm talking today. I want to ask that you think about whatever it is that you do in the world of food, in relationship to food systems or eaters or food, if you would just keep in mind how you might approach what you're doing differently with these sort of cultural and contextual aspects of goodness in mind. And I hope to be able to continue that conversation with you throughout the next couple of days. So my exploration is going to draw on 3 different research projects, and I'm going to sort of pull selectively on evidence from these 3 different projects to explore the cultural and contextual aspects of what makes food good. And I want to start with some findings from the research that I did for Eating Right in America, my book that came out in 2013. This was a history of dietary advice and dietary ideals from the late 19th century to the present. And it was really about the historical relationship between dietary ideals and social ideals. And in order to explore this, I looked at 4 different case studies, 4 different dietary reform movements over the course of the century. I started with the domestic science movement at the end of the 19th century, the turn of the century. Then I looked at the World War II National Nutrition Program. And then I moved to the contemporary era and analyzed the alternative food movement and the campaign against obesity. So I want to pull selectively on this historical research in particular to help us think differently about good food in the present. So I want to start, I'm going to sort of go through 3 major findings from that research. The first sort of big thing that I learned from researching 100 years of dietary advice and dietary ideals is that dietary advice is always both empirical and ethical. So what I mean by that is that on the one hand, dietary advice provides rules for how to eat right? What to do. But at the same time, it always also provides guidelines. Those rules act at the same time as guidelines for how we might make ourselves into certain kinds of people by following those rules, right? How we might make ourselves into moral, responsible people, for example, moral or immoral, responsible or irresponsible, through following or not following the rules of dietary advice. So I want to talk through an example from the turn of the century to help understand this concept of the dual nature of nutrition as both empirical and ethical. This is a table that Wilbur Atwater put together at the turn of the century. He's known as the father of American nutrition. And if we look a little more closely, this is the comparative expenses of food. It was published in 1888 in Century Magazine. And I do want to look a little bit more closely so you can see the kind of information that Atwater is providing here. On the one hand, he has a list of, this is the moment, the sort of emergence of the modern science of nutrition. So very early days for thinking through the lens of the science of nutrition. On the one side here, he has a list of common food materials. Then the price per pound, the amount of each foodstuff that would be available for 25 cents, and then the amount of fats, carbohydrates, and proteins that would be available for 25 cents worth of that food, right? So the concept of a good diet that Atwater is trying to convey here is that the best diet is the one that provides the most nutrients at the least possible cost. Okay, so while Atwater's information here about the amount of fat or calories, fat or protein, for example, that you might be able to get from what do we have here? Mutton leg, for example, emerges from his research in the lab, this overarching idea of what exactly constitutes a good diet, this idea that the best diet is the one that provides the most nutrients at the least possible cost. This concept emerges not from the lab, but from social concerns and from social context. This is a moment of rapid and unsettling industrialization and urbanization. Many among Atwater's social circles in the middle class are very concerned about the kind of chaos that seems to be generated by these social changes in the urban centers in the Northeast. They're worried about the potential for social chaos, particularly the possibility that laborers will take to the streets to demand higher wages. So it makes sense, right, to give people the information that they need so that they can get the most energy for work at the least possible cost. So while this appears to be a purely empirical and very quantitative means of conveying what a good diet is, these are quantities that are expressing qualities, or qualities being expressed as quantities. These are the qualities of frugality, thrift, right, and responsibility being conveyed in the language of numbers, the numerical relationship between price per pound and nutrients available in that amount of food. Okay, so the next big point I want to pull out of the historical research is that the social qualities that are sort of conveyed through dietary ideals have historically been linked to and expressive of ideals of good citizenship. So here I'm drawing on the research that I did in the National Nutrition Program, the World War II era. And here is the Basic 7 Food Guide, which was the major nutritional framework or guideline for that time period. And I love this image because of the way it expresses both the empirical and the ethical in this very sort of literal way. On the outside, you have the basic 7, and the rule is choose from each of these 7 food groups, including butter, by the way. Choose from why don't we have a basic, butter food group anymore? So the rules, right? Choose from each of these every day. And then on the inside, I don't know if you can read it, but it says the U.S. needs us strong, eat the basic 7 every day. So this is the ethical piece, the part that says by following these rules, you can make yourself into a good wartime citizen. And throughout the materials of the National Nutrition Program, which was a nutrition education program during the war, I found this constant conflation of the qualities and characteristics of the good wartime citizen with those of the good eater. So the good eater was constantly being described as having qualities such as courage, willpower, alertness, stamina, a good attitude towards the war, being cooperative, etc., as well as good eyesight and good reflexes. So here's another example of this conflation that I found between the good eater and the good citizen. This is a pamphlet that was distributed to workers in defense plants, and it says at the top, worker, are you helping Uncle Sam? And underneath there's a list of suggestions for how to be a worker who helps Uncle Sam by eating right. There's a picture of this worker who's glowing with good health as he eats his hearty lunch. And some of I don't know if you can read the suggestions, but the first one I'll read for you. It says, eat a hearty lunch every day to help keep you in top-notch physical condition, to make you feel like you're doing job and playing ball with your fellow workers. So this raises an important question, though. If the qualities of being a good eater are so closely related to those of being a good citizen, what does this mean for those who can't or won't or for whatever reason don't eat right? And here's the facing page of the pamphlet. So as you can see, it says, worker, are you helping Hitler? And underneath, there's a series of sarcastic suggestions for how to be both a bad eater and a bad citizen. The first one I'll read again. It says, eat a poor lunch every day so that you will have many accidents, spoil much material, and keep your fellow workers from getting their work done while you quarrel with them. So it's funny, and the suggestions are sarcastic, but underneath this, I think there's something very serious and important going on here, right? Which is that the bad eater is being equated with the very worst form of wartime citizenship, right? With being a traitor. And we might look at this and think this is a product of a less enlightened age, less ironic, this relationship to propaganda was so different, and it was a long time ago. But just looking at a more contemporary example momentarily, we can see that, in fact, things haven't maybe changed so much, right? This is from 2004. This is, in the years following 9/11, but we still have this kind of patriotic imagery and this association between good citizenship and inside of the discourse of the anti-obesity movement. These images are from the National Body Challenge, which was a nationwide diet program that was accompanied by this television show. The images are actually from the TV show. And you can see, I don't think I need to really unpack for you the extent of the association here between the sort of striving to be a good eater and to be a good wartime citizen that's being evoked here. So what I found is that dietary ideals have changed a lot over the course of the last century, as have ideals of good citizenship, but the relationship between them has remained very much the same. So the last big important insight that I want to draw out of this historical research to help us think differently about good food in the present is that dietary advice, as we've seen, is sort of infused with social and moral ideals. They reflect ideals of good citizenship. And there's a very important class dimension to the form of self-making and self-assessment that the language of dietary ideals and dietary advice allows. So there's a very historically significant relationship between dietary health and the middle class. The middle class and scientific nutrition emerged side by side at the end of the 19th century. And the middle class, as many of you I'm sure know, as it was emerging, was also very sort of fragile and not quite clear what its identity or social boundaries, how they might be formed. And health and the pursuit of health became an important way through which the middle class sort of created its unique identity. And within that, dietary health in particular became an important way through which the middle class created its unique identity and character, as well as its social boundaries, particularly with those below them in the social hierarchy. So the middle class came to be known in part through contrast with those outside and who we might think of as unhealthy others. And those who are sort of conceived already as dangerous and irresponsible and failing to be health-seeking in the way that the middle class understands itself as health-seeking. So these images are here to illustrate this point, drawing again on an example from the turn of the century, from the domestic science movement. This image is from the New England kitchen. How many of you are familiar with the New England kitchen? Not so many. So it was the domestic scientists' major reform project in the 1890s. And it was a public kitchen in a poor neighborhood in Boston that was meant to provide scientifically calibrated and well-cooked meals for the sort of immigrant, poor, and working population in the neighborhood. But the idea was that the food was not meant just to feed them, but also to teach them lessons about what it looked like about scientific cookery, and it was meant to elevate their character and the morals by them coming in every day and seeing the process in this very open kitchen. But the project failed due to lack of patronage. And at the very same moment that the New England kitchen began to fail, the reformers had the opportunity to mount a replica at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. And they found that the more quote-unquote intelligent audiences at the fair were much more willing and excited about trying the food that they were serving and about thinking scientifically about food and about choosing food in relationship to health. So this contrast gave them the opportunity to write and think and talk a lot about this contrast between the incorrigible, stubborn poor who were unwilling to taste new dishes and unwilling to eat for health, and the sort of more amenable, flexible, intelligent classes who would with readiness try new foods that were meant that were associated with responsibility and with sort of taking care of the social whole through making good choices. So this contrast between the middle class as health-seeking, and particularly dietary health-seeking, and unhealthy others, and this sort of identity-making contrast plays an important role throughout the century in creating the identity and the character and the social boundaries of the middle class. These contrasts are still very much with us today. So if we return to our green juice, we might think about the many ways in which, even when we think we're using our sort of most quantitative and empirical means for thinking about what makes the green juice good. In fact, there are many important cultural and contextual factors that go into the goodness of the green juice. I would argue, in fact, that we may not even have the craze for green juices and fresh-pressed juices in general that we have today if we didn't also at the same time have the campaign to ban and tax and limit soda consumption. And as this image suggests, there's this sort of illicit back alley big gulp, right, on the cover of the New Yorker suggests there's clearly an important moral component to this contrast. And when we think about good when we think about, green juice drinkers and soda drinkers, clearly we understand them through the lens. We can think about how we understand, for example, the good juice drinker as having many of the same social qualities that we currently associate with good citizenship, right? Personal responsibility, willpower, being an informed consumer who makes healthy and responsible choices in the marketplace, right? In contrast to the bad soda drinker, who we understand as having many of those qualities we currently associate with bad citizenship. For example, being irresponsible, lacking willpower, making ignorant or unsafe choices in the marketplace that endanger not only her own health, right, but the social and economic well-being of all of us. And clearly there's a class dimension to this contrast. So I want to point out that we spend a lot of time thinking about the importance of understanding where our food comes from, right? This is a very important conversation, and we want to understand the values, where our food comes from and the values that it represents. But I think it's also important that we think about where our dietary advice comes from, right? And that we have a more critically engaged conversation about the values that it represents. Okay, so continuing to follow this thread of sort of bumping up against and playing with the edges and limits of what science can tell us and thinking culturally and contextually about what makes food good, I wanted to move to a totally different level of thinking about this. And that has to do with understanding individual food choice. And this is a project that I conducted with two collaborators. Carolyn de la Pena is also a cultural historian, and Sarah Schaefer is a nutritional biologist. We did 25 in-depth interviews trying to understand food choice and the relationship between food choice and health. Now, typically, when people want to understand these things, the research projects involved assumptions or sort of fixed ideas about what goodness and health means. But for this project, we wanted to make understanding what health means the center of our inquiry, rather than a bracketed off set of assumptions. We wanted to understand our subjects' own understanding of health and goodness and how they impacted their food choices. So we had this, I can talk to you more about the methodology later. It was a very unique methodology that we put together in order to elicit this from our subjects. It involved first mapping, these were long, an hour and a half long interviews, first mapping 24 hours of food choice, then discussing deeply the drivers of each food choice. Then we gave our subjects plus and minus cards and asked them to talk about the choices as good or bad and what make them good or bad, making clear, very clear, that it was their understanding of good and bad that we wanted to understand. Then we gave them healthy and unhealthy cards and asked them to do the same. So I want to just draw very selectively again on this research to explore some of the fluid and contextual aspects of goodness, and particularly focusing in on how bad foods can be good. Okay, so a lot of what we found in terms of what made choices good for our subjects had to do oftentimes with an alignment between ideas and information and experience. So what we might think of as good for you, the ideas that are conveyed through, expertise, and what we might think of as good for me. So here the subject is talking about that alignment. She says, I must say, all fruits and vegetables. I think generally they make me feel good. And my education or experiences, they're good for you. They're good for you. So to me, choosing fruits and vegetables is always a good thing, okay? So you can see this alignment between good for you and good for me. But these two things are not always so neatly aligned, right? And we found a lot of cases in which the subject's own sense of good for me is really pushing back against the ideas and information, the good for you. And here's an example of that. It's not necessarily a bad food that she's talking about as being good, but it's a hypothetically bad food. She's pushing back against the idea that it could be bad. So she says, I love tomatoes. And somebody could say they could even have all these published reports out that say they're unhealthy. But because I love them so much, I will look at them as healthy. So just don't take away my tomatoes. Whether they're healthy or not, I'm going to say that they are, right? So she's really pushing it back against the very concept of expertise here. And here's another example. This subject says, when I bite into a raspberry truffle with dark chocolate on the outside, I'm not thinking about the nutritional content of that. But if I bought it and I'm feeling that good about it, it was still a healthy choice for me. Somebody else might not think that is healthy, but to me, that's a very healthy choice. So again, for her, a potentially bad food is very good. And the subject is pushing back against the primacy of nutritional frames and nutritional ways of thinking, asserting her own authority. And like many of our subjects, for her, good food choice had to do with working within a very clear strategy for exercising control over her food choices. And so this is where she's talking about her strategy. She says, I feel if I can eat for my body 85% of the time, and for my mental well-being the other 15%, I'm happy. I'm happy with that. I feel that that is legitimate choice making, and so I try to do that every day. So this subject described in her mind a visual field that contained the 100% total of what she felt was the right amount of food to eat in any given day. And as she went through her day of food choices, each choice would either inhabit the 85% or the 15%, and she could see them filling up over the course of her day. And so for her, and for many of our subjects for whom these control strategies sort of governed their world of food choice, what made the food good wasn't necessarily the food itself, right, but how it fit into these overarching control strategies. And this is very consistent, of course, with what we were just discussing, the findings from the historical research, because control is very central to contemporary notions of good citizenship and health. And so control and exercising control is a major feature of how we understand health-seeking behavior and how these subjects understood the goodness and badness of their choice. So an important takeaway here is that when we see non-compliance, right, people not making the choice that a dietary reformer might want, for example, not choosing good food, it's important to understand that those choices aren't always the result of ignorance or indifference. And at least in the research that I did, I often saw, the failure to comply with dietary norms being understood and interpreted as ignorance or indifference, right? Or lack of responsibility. But we can see here through these examples that it's actually explicit negotiation with prevailing nutritional ideals, explicit negotiation with scientific expertise itself, and also engagement with contemporary notions of good citizenship, right? With the social and cultural and contextual complexity of goodness. So I want to share with you one more piece of this research, and this is a really dense slide, and there's a reason for that. I wanted to convey the denseness and complexity of this person's thought process. So I'm going to read it to you. She says, and see if you can sort of relate to this, her confusion here. I've started eating salmon again probably in the last 6 months, but I have really mixed feelings about that. And that's the animal rights, part of me. I struggle with eating an animal. I know that there are really good reasons to eat salmon. It's a healthy fish, but it doesn't completely negate the way I feel about eating a creature, even though it is just a fish. I still agonize over it. If you read the literature, salmon is a healthy fish. There's still the whole issue of farm salmon versus wild-caught salmon, and then the whole issue of sustainability. And I'm also an environmental activist, and all this is in my mind. And when there's a drought, the salmon don't reproduce as much, so there's not as many wild-caught salmon. And then the farm salmon has a whole set of issues, So this is a struggle in my own mind that I try and weigh all of this. So we saw, as you can see in this example, we saw a lot of confusion about how to think about goodness. A lot of our subjects talked explicitly about, being uncertain which frame to choose. And we certainly see a proliferation as consumers demand and as we demand more information about where our food comes from, a proliferation of the possible frames for understanding what makes it good or to understand if it's good. So how can science help us with a dilemma like this, right? Science can tell us a lot of things that are important here, such as about the nutritional aspects of the salmon, right? About the environmental impacts of various kinds of production. And science could probably even tell us whether or not salmons can suffer, right? But it can't answer this person's dilemma here of whether she should understand salmon primarily as a form of nutrients or nutrition, or whether she should think of it, and understand its goodness through an ecological lens and think about it as something that's connected to an ecological matrix. Or maybe if she should consider it primarily as a sentient being, It can't answer the question of which of these ways of understanding what salmon is are the best ones for telling her the food choice how to make her food choices and be at peace with her food choices. So this transitions to the last project that I want to dip into to help us through this tour of thinking culturally and contextually about what makes food good. I want to draw on some preliminary findings and offer some provocations related to my current research. That's really about contemporary contests, debates and contests and conflicts about who gets to define what good food is, and the kind of questions about food that matter, the kind of expertise about food that matter, and which frames we should be thinking about when we think about what makes food good. So, what if I were to tell you that this green juice was mass-produced, conveniently packaged, enhanced nutritionally through processing, and also had it sort of stabilized for a longer shelf life through additives or preservatives or processing? Is this for you? Is this still good food? Right? For many, the argument would be, or the response would be, this is better food. This is food that is healthier, more nutritious, safer, and lasts longer, less likely to be wasted, right? Because of all the benefits of processing. But obviously, right, and of course, there are many, perhaps many of you in the room, for whom processing is the antithesis of good food, right? So if I were to tell you all of those things about this green juice, it may not be good food anymore. I increasingly see the food industry responding to consumer concerns, and food science also, responding to concerns about whether or not their food is good, with assertions of scientific information and facts and expertise. But my proposal, of course, is that science can't answer these questions because they are political questions in their nature. They're political debates. They're linked to larger debates about the future of food and to the kinds of questions about food that matter. And the different points of view on whether or not processing would make this green juice or any other food better, they really represent and emerge from incommensurate ways of thinking about food, the incommensurate frames, and maybe even, I want to propose, incommensurate understandings of fundamentally what food is, of the very nature of food itself. So I want to explore this briefly, starting with this mapping of these different perspectives as a framing contest between two different frames. And I'm proposing that we understand this debate or this conflict over the kinds of questions and expertise around food that matter as a contest between two different frames that we might understand as, on the one hand, real food, and on the other, real facts. So the real food frame, and so these are different ways of understanding processed food and thinking about the problem and the solutions related to processing. So for the real food framework, the problem of processed food can be understood in three different ways, and these are related and overlapping, but also distinct ways of thinking. It can be understood as a problem of ingredients, right? What's in the food. As a problem of effects in terms of public health of widespread consumption of processed food, or as a problem that has to do with the food system that produces large amounts of highly processed food. And the solution to this problem is often understood as avoiding processed food in order to change the food system. I'm sure you're familiar with this. Processed food is very much understood as an unhealthy product of a troubled food system that is cheap at checkout but paid for elsewhere. And the proponents of this point of view are typically concerned consumers, the public health community, alternative food advocates, and some nutrition authorities as well. And in response to the real food frame has emerged what I'm calling the real facts frame. And from this perspective, the problem is entirely different. The problem isn't processed food, but rather misinformed consumers, their irrational fears, unfair criticisms, and the amplification that those unfair criticisms and misinformed fears can receive through social media. So the solution from this point of view is education and information, better understanding of the science and technology, and sort of improving overall scientific literacy, but particularly literacy in terms of food science and agriculture. So from this point of view, processing is understood through its benefits, and it's typically promoted by food science, the food and agriculture industry, and some nutrition authorities. So here you see the sort of attempt is to use scientific forms of expertise to answer a series of questions or problems in the real foods frame that are really not about scientific expertise, can't really be answered through the facts, because these conflicts are about worldview and values. But as I said, I want to propose that they're also about incommensurate understandings of the very nature of food. So I want to draw here on Anne-Marie Moll's work. She talks about dieting techniques. And here she's saying that different dieting techniques do not mobilize different representations of a single reality. Instead, each of them engages with, enacts, and evokes the action of its own reality. The food that is relevant to one dieting technique is simply not the same thing as the food that is relevant to another. So I want to propose that this may be also the case in terms of these processed food frames. That the kind of food that is relevant to one frame is simply not the same thing as the food that is relevant to another. And in order to illustrate this a bit, I'm going to once again dive into some evidence, just very selectively pull out some examples that I think can help us think this through. And these examples come from two competing school curriculum. The first one, the one that represents the real food frame, is the Food Inc. discussion guide. Have any of you seen it? Yeah, so it's a high school curriculum that was put together alongside the release of the Food Inc. DVD. It was distributed along with 3,000 free copies of the DVD to schools nationwide, but is also easily available online. And in direct response to the Food Inc. curriculum, the International Food Information Council formed the Alliance to Feed the Future, which is, so the IFIC, the International Food Information Council, for those of you who don't know, is an industry-backed group, an industry lobbying group, and they formed the Alliance to Feed the Future, sponsored by industry members, to put together their own school curriculum to respond to the misinformation that they felt were being promoted through the Food Inc. discussion guide. But their curriculum covers K through 8. So looking at these two curriculum has really illustrated to me both the framing contest that I just mapped out for you, but also it started me thinking that perhaps, a framing contest, the concept of framing contest suggests that it's two different ways of seeing the same thing, right? But looking at these curriculum, I've started to think that it's not just two different ways of seeing the same thing, but two very different things, in fact, at the center. Okay, so both of these curriculum are really invested in teaching, among other things, teaching students where their food comes from. So here, looking at the Food Inc. discussion guide, some examples to illustrate what it means to teach students where food comes from within this frame. So here, understanding where food comes from is about tracing connections between food and other systems, right? Tracing connections between what we put in our mouths and economic, social, political, and environmental systems. It's about understanding those connections and that reveals hidden costs, right? Revealing the hidden costs and then taking responsibility for them. You can see this is the heading for a whole chapter on hidden costs. And this is an exercise from one of the lessons, and it asks students to reflect on where they stand on this continuum between I'll buy what I like to eat no matter who makes it, and I'll only buy food from companies whose values I agree with, right? So thinking about those connections, revealing hidden costs, and then taking responsibility for accounting for those hidden costs through doing things like voting with your fork. And you can see that that's the last page of the curriculum. So here, of course, the vote is symbolic, right? It has to do with taking responsibility. In the real food curriculum, the Alliance to Feed the Food curriculum, the fork is actually very literal. And the concept of what it means to teach students where their food comes from has to do very much with sort of tracing a sequence of steps and events. So rather than thinking about connections and responsibility, it's about understanding the ingredients and processes that food comes from. It's about better understanding those ingredients and processes so that their benefits can be appreciated. So rather than taking responsibility, it's about appreciating the benefits of these steps and processes. And you can see this is a poster from the curriculum. And if you follow the arrows, that's Professor G.U. Eatwell, who's sort of the character for the curriculum. And you can see she's sort of talking through the steps in the system. She's talking about the benefits of science and technology at each one of the steps. Here, I have a pointer. Here, she's talking about the benefits of food processing in particular. And these are food ingredients cards from a lesson where students learn to sort ingredients by their function, and they learn to understand the beneficial function of things like guar gum and xanthan gum by thinking about the benefits of emulsifiers and fat replacers and fortification and enrichment, et cetera. So the idea here is that food is best, where food comes from has to do with processes and ingredients, and the purpose is to better understand their benefits. So a very different understanding of what it means to think about where food comes from that is rooted in a very different understanding of what food is. So on the one hand, in the real food set way of thinking, we have an understanding or conceptualization or enacting of what food is that really is oriented around understanding food as matter that connects, as matter that mediates relationships between the human and natural world, and that therefore, by its fundamental nature, engenders responsibility. We can know its goodness through its impacts and its connections, because fundamentally what it is something that connects, is matter that connects. It's part of a matrix. And therefore, processing, in this point of view, doesn't just make food less good. It makes food less food-like. Because it distances and abstracts the food, right, from its connections. It attenuates those relationships. And it prioritizes convenience over, and maybe even pleasure too, but especially convenience over responsibility, right? Makes food less food-like. Now, in the real facts frame, the food that is being referred to and enacted and brought into being through this form of expertise is something that is known through its content. The content being, the matter whose being is to meet individual needs for pleasure and nutrition and convenience. Fundamentally a commodity whose goodness can be known by its content, by what's in it, rather than by what it's connected to. And its success in meeting its role as a commodity and meeting those consumer needs. So in this point of view, from this point of view, processing makes food more food-like, right? Not just better, not just more good, but more food-like, because it allows it to fulfill its needs fulfill its purpose, right? For pleasure and nutrition and convenience, and for it to be a successful commodity. So the takeaway from this, I think, is that these are really important questions that can't be resolved through more scientific literacy and through more education and information, but rather need to be addressed through real conversations about the political nature of the debate. The question really is which reality is better or worse to live with, right? And these are political questions in their nature, and we need real dialogue about these debates. And we need the food industry, frankly, to do more than either, reformulation to meet these concerns, which is, so there's two strains happening at the same time. They're reformulating to meet consumer concerns while pushing back against those concerns and reframing them as matters of scientific ignorance. And I think that we need collaboration and dialogue around the political nature of these questions and these debates. So I want to leave you with a few takeaways. We'll talk about this in a minute. But first, the big takeaways from what I've explored with you today. First, as consumers, right? As I mentioned earlier, thinking critically not just about where our food comes from, but also where our dietary advice comes from. And also we can become more critically aware of the different frames and lenses on what makes food good that is in operation at any given moment. We can start to think, as we're experiencing conversations about whether or not food is good or bad, for example, or claims that it's good or claims that it's bad, we can try to understand the different frames that are being used at different times and sort of sort through those conflicting information by thinking about the claims and counterclaims and the various sort of claims to goodness. So as reformers or activists, right, or as people trying to bring more good food or good eaters into the world or new modes of eating right into the world, I think it's very important that we not mistake disagreement for misunderstanding, and that we not mistake resistance for ignorance, right? Resistance to eating right or choosing not to eat right has very much historically had to do with its embedded norms and values. You can imagine that throughout, in response to the dietary reformers for the last century, that the targets of dietary reform are aware that there are social norms, social values embedded in dietary ideals. And resistance, again, isn't simply ignorance or indifference, but it can be also resistance to those norms or ideals. And bad food choice, right, can come from conscious negotiation with expert knowledge, with expertise itself. As researchers, we clearly can no longer approach solving the major problems facing us in the world of food and in the future of food, from any one disciplinary perspective. And that is what I find so very inspiring about the premise of the food systems work being done on this campus and in this conference. We need exactly what Doug was talking about this morning in terms of transdisciplinarity. And I'm so inspired to know that it's happening here. I work on a wonderful campus, and I'm very blessed to work across disciplines, but the infrastructure isn't there. We need infrastructure, we need incentives that work. We need programs that train a new class of thinkers who understand and are skilled at thinking across disciplinary divides. And I was very pleased to hear Doug mention this morning as well. We also need research that helps us to better understand best practices, the practices for supporting and engaging in research that can allow us to listen across disciplinary difference, to work across disciplinary difference, and to move forward with this sort of complex understandings of goodness. So I'm really very delighted to have the opportunity to spend a couple of days with you all exploring this transdisciplinary dialogue, and I will leave you with a riddle, right? This is the Juicero. How many of you have seen it? You know what it is? $700 for the machine. And then you sign up for a subscription service to have, like, I think they're $5 to $10 packets of chopped up fruits and vegetables FedEx to your door. And then you put them in the machine, and out comes an 8-ounce glass of juice. And it's already on the market. It's received 120 million-ish in venture funding from the likes of Google and Campbell's Soup and others very much interested in the future of food. So I want to leave you to ponder the question, and I look forward to talking with you about this later. Is this good food? So thank you very much.